Dixie here. Today I want to talk to you about the most frequently asked questions I've received since finishing my thru hike of the Florida Trail. And hopefully for those of y'all who are considering section hiking or thru hiking the Florida Trail, this information will be useful. First, let's talk about wildlife because that seems to be the biggest concern, specifically alligators. I have to admit, I was a little bit timid before starting my thru hike of the Florida Trail, knowing that I would be trompsing through alligator territory. But after I started to hang out with them a little bit and to see them really frequently, I started to understand their typical behavior. And first of all, when I was going through Big Cypress, the first 30 miles of the Florida Trail, the only place I saw alligators was at the Oasis Visitor Center, right there at the southern terminus of the Florida Trail. And they were on the other side of a fence next to a big canal. Alligators tend to like deeper waters more than shallow waters. I'm not saying that you won't find them in shallow water, but when you're going through areas that are ankle deep all the way up to hip deep or so, I mean, obviously it depends on your height, but if you're an average sized human being, then alligators probably prefer to be in deeper waters because they can flee, they feel more safe in deeper water. So when I was going through the Big Cypress area, I didn't see any more alligators after the visitor center until I crossed over I-75 and got to the northern part of Big Cypress National Preserve, and that's where there is a canal, and you're road walking next to this canal that has a lot of alligators on the side of the canal. And immediately as I started seeing them, I noticed that if I got too close, they fled. They wanted to get away from me. They didn't come at me or try to attack me or anything like that. And I'd also heard that if you were around a mother and babies, that she could get more aggressive than maybe another alligator would be that wasn't protecting its young. But even the alligators that I saw around babies fled from me. If I walked past a big pond and didn't even notice them, they'd thrash and get in the water, or, you know, I'd see them in there with their babies, and if I was taking a video of them, a lot of times they would kind of lower down in the water. They just don't want to interact with humans any more than you probably want to interact with them. So I learned very quickly that alligators typically just flee, and they're not these big, scary, aggressive monsters that everyone thinks that they are. Now, not saying there can't be a freak thing, but if you give them a wide berth, then typically they're gonna do the same for you. And for those of y'all concerned about at camp, is an alligator gonna try to come into your tent to get you, or do you have to worry about one trying to bite your booty while you go pee in the middle of the night? That's really not a thing to be worried about. I mean, there is a chance in some areas, like especially on the levees, where an alligator could be next to your tent, but again, that's because you're right near a deep body of water that they like to live in. So chances are they could come up on the levee to get prepared to bask in the sun, or just because they're getting out of the water. So by happenstance, they could be near your tent. So in those areas where you're near a large body of water, then I would make sure just to check with your headlamp, make some noise, you know, brush around with your trekking pole a little bit, and you'll be fine. But most of your typical campsites on the Florida Trail aren't right next to a deep pool of water. One instance where you should be a bit leery of alligators is when you're collecting water. Now, a lot of water sources on the Florida Trail are not deep pools of water. They might be little streams or even pumps, spigots, etc. But in the instance that you are collecting water out of a deep pond or a river, then sure, you want to keep an eye out for alligators. So just kind of scan the area, approach the water, scoop your water up, and then leave the edge of the water to go filter your water. You don't want to just sit right there and hang out and give more of an opportunity for something to happen. But alligators don't view humans, from what I understand, as a typical food source. Now, when there is dim light, like early in the morning or later on in the evening, they could potentially mistake you for a smaller animal when you're crouched down next to the edge of the water, scooping up water. So again, if you have to be next to the water at those times, I would try to make a lot of noise so that it's like, hey, you know, I'm here, I'm scaring you away, I'm not food. And also just make your time there brief in general. You don't want to be mistaken for a small deer crouched down. And that's why I feel like dogs and smaller children get attacked a bit more, because they look like a tasty smaller treat. All in all, just use caution when approaching deep water. Give the alligators a wide berth, and I think that you'll see they're a bit more afraid of you than you are them. Next, let's talk about snakes. I know a lot of people probably think, I'm not hiking the Florida Trail, there are just too many venomous snakes, and actually I know people think that because a lot of people commented that on the videos. But honestly, any trail that you're gonna hike in the US for the most part will have venomous snakes out there. It's just their habitat. And while, yes, we did see a lot of snakes on the Florida Trail and more venomous snakes than I've seen on any other thru hike, the Pacific Crest Trail was a close second. And the Florida Trail is 1,100 miles approximately, and that's a pretty similar distance to the Pacific Crest Trail through the state of California, so it really wasn't that far off. But I think the biggest hang-up people have with snakes on the Florida Trail is that the venomous snake that seems to be the most spotted out there is the water moccasin, and that was true for me. And there's this myth that's been going around for years and years that water moccasins, aka cottonmouths, are the most aggressive venomous snake, and they'll come find you, you know, hunt you down and bite you, or jump out of the bushes and bite you. And that's just not true. And if you're mad at me and want to fight me right now because your peepaw's great uncle Billy had a story about how a water moccasin chased him up a hill for a mile or something like that, I mean, I'm not saying it can't ever happen, but it's just not typically the case. If you've ever had a water moccasin come at you, it's probably because you had water behind you, or for some reason they felt like that was the safest and quickest route to flee away from you. All of the snakes I saw on the Florida Trail wanted to either completely ignore me and act like I didn't exist, or they just wanted to get away from me, especially the water moccasins. And if you don't believe me, you don't want to take my word for it, then I'm going to put a link to a study in the video description of this video. In this study, where people went out into the woods and encountered water moccasins, when they simply stood right next to the snake, 0% of water moccasins tried to bite them. When stepped on, less than 20% of the water moccasins tried to bite. And then even when picked up, only 36% of those snakes actually struck the human that picked them up. And that's when you hear about snake bites the most, is when people try to mess with a snake, whether they're trying to run it off, move it, pick it up and hold it, kill it, whatever. That's when people are most likely to be bitten. So if you just leave it alone, chances are it's not going to mess with you. And if it makes you feel any better, if you happen to be in the very small percentage of people who actually get bitten by a snake while out on trail, then most people who seek medical attention after being snake bitten by a venomous snake recover just fine. You actually have a very small chance of dying from a snake bite. It's like pretty much impossible, and you have to already be in bad health, or again, you don't seek medical attention, etc. And the good news is, on a side note, you do have cell reception most of the Florida Trail, or if you carry something like the inReach with you, or a spot device, or a personal locator beacon, then you can call for help if the rare chance occurs that you are bitten by a venomous snake. In fact, you're actually more likely to die from a lightning strike in Florida than from a snake bite. But if all of this doesn't make you feel better, then if you start earlier on the Florida Trail, you're gonna have less chance of seeing snakes and other reptiles out because it's cold. So if you start November, December, then as you go through the trail, you're still going to be in those cooler months than if you start later, like I did in February. When I first started seeing water moccasins, I mean, yes, of course, it's a little unnerving, but as you go along, you get better at spotting them. And for me, I just got a little bit more comfortable when I realized all of that nonsense I had heard about them being so aggressive just wasn't true. Another animal that I've heard a lot of people say will attack you in the woods is a hog. And there were some wild hogs out on the Florida Trail. I finally got to capture one or two, so I was pretty excited about that. But the same thing with the hogs as the snakes. They just want to get away, and honestly, the hogs more than the snakes probably, because as soon as they saw us or heard us, they were fleeing. And there were a couple of times where I wanted to capture them. I could hear them rooting nearby the tent, and I'd try to open up the tent and look, and they'd run off. So the only time that you really find hogs being aggressive to humans is when they're cornered up, when they're injured, or in a hunting situation, you know, where you've got dogs and they're already being agitated, etc. So if you're just walking down the Florida Trail hiking, chances are you don't have to worry about hogs at all. And finally, the Florida Panther. This is one of the animals that I didn't get to see on the Florida Trail that I really hope to see. And there are no documented cases of Florida Panthers attacking humans. Next, let's talk about bugs, specifically mosquitoes and ticks. I'm usually not somebody who likes to wear bug spray at all. I didn't, except for one day on the entire AT. I don't think I did at all on the PCT or the CDT, but anytime that I've worn bug spray, it's like one instance out of many, many days. But the Florida Trail is a different beast when it comes to bugs. There seem to be mosquitoes quite frequently. I would have loved to cowboy camp on the Florida Trail, but the bugs at night just wouldn't really allow for that. And as the temperatures get warmer, of course, more bugs come out, and especially I noticed an increase in ticks when it got warmer. So I had some DEET out there, I had some picaridin out there. In my opinion, the picaridin seemed to work a little bit better, and I prefer that anyway because picaridin is safe on clothing, whereas DEET can melt your gear or cause your clothing to kind of deform a little bit. So the picaridin lotion, especially, that we used out there seemed to work really well, repelling mosquitoes and also ticks. Something that I didn't do, but you can do, and I might do going forward if I was to thru hike the Florida Trail again, is treat my clothing with permethrin. You can treat your clothing, you can treat your gear. There are also services available that can do the treatments for you, and they even have specialized clothing lines where the clothing has been treated with permethrin. Permethrin, however, is not intended to be used on your skin, so you treat the stuff, let it dry, and then it's safe to use. And just as a side note, if you're going to be doing this yourself or if you're going to have permethrin in your home, it is highly toxic to cats. One of the reasons that I don't like to use poisons, in addition to not wanting pesticides on myself every day, is that then I don't really want to get into any water sources to cool off and wash those pesticides into the water, which on the Florida Trail I wasn't really trying to get into too much deep water anyway, but also if I'm handling any little critters, bugs, etc., snakes, frogs, I try to keep that in mind so I don't do those things when I know I have poison on me. With ticks, if you're able to spot a tick and pull it off of you within 24 hours, then typically your chances of getting a tick-borne illness are pretty much slim to none. So I try to check myself twice a day for ticks. One, when I get in my tent at night, I just check real good when I change into my pajamas, and then again when I wake up in the morning. And if you're thinking, well, why would you check again when you've just been sleeping? Because sometimes they can be hanging out on your gear or have found their way into the tent and then find a nice meal while you're sleeping at night. So I just like to do a recheck again in the morning when I have daylight, because I tend to night hike. And that way I'm sure that I'm catching them before they've been on for 24 hours. Yellow flies were really aggravating towards the end of our hike, but we started much later than most people typically do on a thru hike. But if you're section hiking in the warmer months, or you tend to have a thru hike that runs late like mine did, then you might encounter some swarms of yellow flies. I highly recommend having a fly swat with you, and that way you can fight back if they do start attacking you. And finally, fire ants. I had a few questions about that. Fire ants weren't really an issue. I did see fire ant beds out there. I only stepped in a fire ant bed one time while I was setting up my tent, and then I was mindful to look for those going forward, and I didn't have any more issues. Solo hiking the Florida Trail. Several people asked me if I didn't have somebody to hike the Florida Trail with, would I still go? Or would I recommend this trail as a solo hike for an individual? Now, me personally, yes, I would definitely thru hike the Florida Trail alone. I would thru hike any trail alone. I understand how this trail could be a more challenging trail to do alone though. And a friend of mine that I met from the AT community actually started the Florida Trail and then ended up quitting early, and he says he'll go back and fill in the sections and stuff over time, but he said that he didn't enjoy doing the Florida Trail alone. If he had had friends around, then the harder days would have been more bearable because you have somebody to complain to at least, and I completely understand that. So I think, you know, the AT versus the Florida Trail, the AT is definitely better to do as a solo hiker because there is so much traffic out there. You meet so many people along the way, whereas the Florida Trail or the Continental Divide Trail, those are more mentally challenging trails because you are alone so much of the time and don't see a lot of people out there. So do I think you might have more success if you surround yourself around other hikers for a thru hike of the Florida Trail? Sure, but it's not a trail that I would say, oh my gosh, no, definitely don't do that alone because it's not safe. Now I want to cover drinking water. Honestly, water on the Florida Trail was probably one of the things I was disappointed about the most, because you think, Florida, there's a lot of humidity, there's a lot of water, so you must have a plethora of sources to drink from. And you do, but they're not necessarily good water sources. We started hitting the best water I had seen on trail around mile 1000. Prior to that, a lot of the sources had sulfur water, so they smelled like rotten eggs and, you know, kind of had a little bit of a wonky taste. Thankfully, I guess for me, I still have no sense of smell, so I guess that's one way. The one sunny side of that is that I couldn't smell the rotten egg water. There are also sources that have a lot of tannins in them, so neither of these is bad for you to drink. It's safe to drink. If something smells like sulfur, it's safe to drink. If it's very dyed water and looks like tea but might not have a bad taste to it. One thing that helped a lot with both of these situations is having drink mixes. So once I filtered my water into a clean bottle, then I would do like a Crystal Light packet, Hawaiian Punch, you know, something to just mix it up. So I'm tricking my brain to cover, well, the smell for some people, definitely the color of it, and just all around like, oh, I've got something nice to drink. And when you cook with it, you know, it mixes into your food and you can't really tell anyway. But even some of the water out of the spigots smelled like sulfur or tasted a little weird. So there's just not great water necessarily along the trail. But more than anything, it's more of a mental hurdle. And I would say that that was probably my biggest mental challenge of the Florida Trail. Just something new that I hadn't really had to deal with before. My biggest concern as far as safety of drinking water along the Florida Trail was pesticides in the water. And this was especially in areas like the levee section at the beginning, where you're in all of this sugar cane and, you know, all of that water is running off down into the canal. So I didn't really want to drink from the canals. But thankfully, due to trail angels like Ari, there are several people that maintain water caches along those sections of trail so that you don't have to drink that nasty pesticide water. And there are comments in Guthook, the app that I use to navigate, about where those water sources or water caches are located, but also there is a running spreadsheet that people keep updated as they pass the water sources, and that's available in those Florida Trail groups that I mentioned earlier, and I'll put the links to those groups in the video description. Unfortunately, in the river sections, there's like the Kissimmee River, the Swanee River, just different areas where you're constantly following a river. You think, hey, I've got plenty of water, and you do, and you can drink it, and I don't think from getting a little pesticides or chemicals that you're gonna immediately grow a thumb out of your forehead. But I just preferred not to drink out of those sources if I could help it, and I actually never had to drink out of one of those large bodies of water like one of the rivers. I kind of held out for a smaller spring or a pond, or, you know, just something different. So a lot of times I carried more water than was probably necessary just because I wanted to avoid those areas, but you don't have to do that. But the Sawyer squeeze that I use and a lot of people use takes care of a lot of bad things in the water, but it doesn't filter out chemicals, pesticides, etc. There were a couple of other times, like right before St. Mark's, where water was a bit of a concern, but for a different reason, because it was potentially brackish. In Guthook, it's definitely noted, hey, this water source could potentially be brackish, you know, have too much salt where it's not safe to drink. And they listed tidal charts, so you could check that to see if there was a good likelihood of it being salty or not. And then they even warn you, filter just a little bit and then taste it and see if it tastes salty. And people left comments about that, but I just decided not to fool with it. The Sawyer squeeze isn't going to remove salt from the water, so I didn't risk it, and again, just carried more water through those sections. So that's one thing I would definitely warn you about, is to check gut hook ahead of time, read all of the water sources before you leave the source that you're at, and make sure you know how much water you need to get to the next actual safe, good water source. Now, speaking of water, let's talk about walking in it. It seems a lot of folks wonder exactly what percent of the Florida Trail is underwater. How much am I going to actually have to trudge through if I thru hike the Florida Trail? And the answer to that, unfortunately, is it depends. I can't give you an exact amount because it really does depend on the time of year that you're out there, how much waterfall Florida has had recently, etc. A lot of factors go into it, and it's different every year. For example, when I started this year in Big Cypress going northbound, Big Cypress had like a record year for water for a very long time. I loved it though. The water was clear. There were fish swimming along with me while I was hiking. It made Big Cypress absolutely gorgeous, and in my opinion, more enjoyable than if I had to just slop through mud the whole time. So I prefer a little bit of standing water over just boot sucking mud, as they call it. But on the other side of that, the Swanee River, when I went through that section, I got my feet wet, I think maybe one time, whereas just a few weeks before me, the people who started the Florida Trail at the typical time that you would start, like at the beginning of January, they were having to swim through water at some parts. There was water chest deep in areas, and that was a very troublesome section for those people. But you know, a few weeks later, it was absolutely fine for me. So things can change quickly on the Florida Trail. The Bradwell Bay section, which I would say was the most difficult part of the Florida Trail, and I've heard it described as that by a lot of different people, was hip deep in some areas with water. Also, there were blowdowns. It's just not a very well-maintained section of trail. In some years, or at some times of the year, that's absolutely dry. So there's not one specific number to describe how much water is in a certain section. So if you're thru hiking, you just kind of got to go with what's given to you. If you're section hiking, you might can control that a bit more and decide to go hike a different section at a time where there is less water. But I will say, the areas that will have water levels that can be very high and dangerous, and even most of the swampy areas that I wouldn't say are extremely dangerous, there's some sort of walk around or alternate if you want to take that. So a high water route. Me personally, I enjoy the challenge and all of the wildlife that I come across in those swampy areas, but you know, there may be an alternate trail or road walk, some way to get around those sections if you choose to. Now let's talk about foot care in the instances where you are trouncing through a lot of water day in and day out. The best thing that you can do for your feet to prevent any kind of foot fungus, blisters, etc., is to let them air out as much as possible. One way that you can make sure you're doing this is when you stop and take a break, take your wet socks off, peel them off, put your shoes out, maybe take your insoles out, let them dry out in the sun, just any chance you get. Also at night, if it's not cold where you got to sleep with socks on, or you're not extremely cold natured and you can just let them air out all night while you sleep, that's a really good idea. Now, I like to rotate out socks. It's kind of a little method that I do to make sure that I'm putting dry socks on my feet periodically. So maybe at night, I peel my wet socks off for the night, rinse them out, and then set them aside. You can try to air dry them in camp, but chances are with the dampness of the night and in the morning, they're gonna be wet anyway. But put on dry socks in the morning, and then even if your shoes are wet, because if you don't hit a wet spot, they'll dry out pretty quickly as long as you don't have any Gore-Tex or waterproofing. Then when you stop and take a break and you're letting everything air out, letting your feet air out, once you get done with that break, if you've had those wet socks from the night before drying on your pack the whole day, Then you put those dry socks on, and the ones that you were wearing up until lunch, you can rinse those out and hang them on your pack, so hopefully by the next morning they'll be dry for you to put on. So you can really do this with 2 pairs of socks. I'm not a person who is typically blister prone, but I wore Injinji socks on the Florida Trail to just kind of help prevent that, because I don't typically go on trails where I'm in water quite as much as the Florida Trail. So what Injinjis do is they just take that friction that would normally be skin to skin between your toes, and it puts the friction on that fabric to kind of help mitigate the rubbing of your toes, which would cause blisters. But the best thing that you can do preventative care for your feet is let them dry out as much as possible, and if you feel a hot spot forming, take care of it immediately. If you don't have anything in your pack that is specifically for blister care, because maybe you're not typically blister prone, or you don't know if you are or not, if you've got some duct tape, that is better than nothing, just to help remove that friction from the spot that's getting tender. And duct tape is a great multi-purpose tool for repair, etc. Waterproof band-aids seem to work pretty well. They at least seem to work better than regular band-aids, which to me are pretty much completely useless. Once you sweat, they come right off. And moleskin seems to be the thing that most people sing praises to when dealing with blisters, because it helps cushion the area, but also once again removes that friction from the area that's hurting. Some people have also had luck using Body Glide on their feet just to make them a little bit more slick. It's all kind of a game of trial and error, but those are at least some places where you can start if you're on the Florida Trail and you start getting blisters. So what about camping in these swampy areas? That was something that I was wondering before I started. Am I going to be stuck walking miles and miles and miles through the swamp before I can get to a campsite? And the way that the Florida Trail Association seems to have designed the campsites is with knowing that people will be walking through a swampy area. So I never felt like I had to go an unreasonable amount of miles, or, you know, I wasn't just like stuck in the swamp trying to find a high piece of ground. If you have the Guthook app, there's a lot of good information in there about water sources, navigation, etc., but also campsites. So you can look ahead a day or two. I don't suggest planning your whole 3-month hike out before you ever leave the house, but I always try to look ahead a day or two so I know what to expect, what's coming up. And sure, there might be some instances where you have to make a decision. Do I want to go 9 miles today or 17? But that's not common. That's not something that you deal with a lot on the Florida Trail. And luckily, the campsites that are designated are just higher points where it's typical dry ground. And if those are flooded, then usually that means the trail is not safe to hike anyway, because the whole area is extremely flooded. And you'll know because there will either be a closure or some sort of river levels that you can check. There were several links in Guthook with information, you know, check this website, and if the river is at such and such feet, the trail ahead is not safe to hike, so take this reroute instead. In the super swampy areas, stealth camping, which is just camping where there's not a designated site, might not be as plentiful as in areas that are dry, but you can read comments of people that went before you. There still may be some areas that would be okay to camp in, but there's enough camping where you're not going to be hiking like 20 hours straight searching for dry ground. So what about going to the bathroom in swampy areas? Well, just like with the campsites, there is enough dry land that if you need to go to the bathroom, chances are you're going to find a spot. And if you're in such an emergency that you can't find a dry spot, you're probably just going to find a spot anyway. But of course, yes, for leave no trace principles, it's best if you don't go number 2 or number 1 for that matter in the water of the swamp, especially somewhere like Big Cypress where people are going to be collecting their water. But just like you're going to come across camping areas regularly, you can find a place to go to the bathroom. In Big Cypress, it was a little sketchy. Thankfully, it seems like most people are respectful of, hey, this area is for a tent, and you know, maybe I should follow this little trail back here to go to the bathroom, but you're certainly not the first person that's gone to the bathroom in that area. So chances are you could possibly find some buried treasure on a small little island camping situation, but it's not like that for the whole trail. You know, I found concentrated areas more in Big Cypress than in any other of the swampy areas. it's not like you're just in water straight for hours and hours and hours as a typical situation. Usually you find some water patches that you walk through for a mile or so, and then you might pop out on a little bit of dry land and then back in it. But the areas like Big Cypress and Bradwell Bay, you may be in water for a few hours at a time, but that's just not typical. Now that we've covered walking in water, let's talk about walking on roads. The Florida Trail has no shortage of road walks or walking on hardened surfaces like sidewalks, dirt roads, etc. There's just a lot of civilization walking, if you will. But I really liked the mixture of it. If I had to guess what percentage of the trail is on a road, pavement, dirt, sidewalk, etc., rails to trail type thing, I would say maybe a third or so. I might be overestimating there or even underestimating. I don't know the exact value. You could probably look at Guthook and figure it out. But it's a good bit for sure. So if that's not really your thing, then this might not be the thru hike for you. To me, a thru hike is about the entire experience, the good with the bad, the being in the middle of the wilderness and also being in civilization, you know, dodging snakes, dodging cars, like all of that is part of the experience to me, and I like it as a whole. But if you're not really looking to thru hike the Florida Trail and you just want to do some section hikes, then you don't have to worry about the road walks. Just do the parts that seem like they would be enjoyable to you. But as a thru hiker, for sure you're going to have to deal with a good bit of road walking on the Florida Trail. And I think as the trail gets more traffic, more attention, more resources, that more and more they'll be able to move some of those road walks off into the woods. I like road walking because I like finding little treasures along the way, the stores, and also not having to have such a heavy resupply, because oftentimes when you're on road walks, you're going to intercept a gas station or a grocery store, etc., hotel, laundromat, you know, all of the good things about normal life. But of course, walking beside traffic can be dangerous, and it can also be very hard on your feet. So having trail runners or boots or whatever you prefer that perform well on the trail and also on the roads is something that I think is pretty important. So I started off with the Topo Athletic TerraVenture 2s, and those were much more of a sturdy shoe than what I eventually went to, which was the Ultra Lone Peak 5. So I mentioned in the gear video that I did about the gear I had on the Florida Trail that if I could have a fairy godmother appear and hand me the Topo Athletics when I was on the road walk, and then at some points of the actual trail receive the Ultra Lone Peak 5s, then that would be awesome, but it's not worth it to me to carry both because of the weight. So I think if I had to do it again and I could only have one of those pairs of shoes, I would go with the Topo Athletic TerraVenture 2s, but the Lone Peak 5s were fine. I just happened to notice that my feet were a little bit more sore at the end of a road walk in those than the TerraVenture 2s. Also in that gear video I did on the Florida Trail, I mentioned having an umbrella. If you're gonna thru hike the Florida Trail and do these long exposed areas like road walks, then I think it's very important to have an umbrella, because that way you have instant shade whenever you need to escape the sun, even if there are no trees nearby. Another thing to look out for when you're on the road walks is places to camp. Sometimes you'll have road walks that are so long you might not complete it in a day, so you have the situation of one, trying to stealth somewhere along the roadside. And again, if you have the Guthook app, people will often leave comments in Guthook about where they were able to stealth camp safely, what to look for, landmarks, etc. But you also have the option of hitchhiking. So you could always hitchhike to the trailhead, either back south or up ahead north, camp there, and then in the morning wake up, hitchhike back to the spot that you stopped at the day before that you hitchhiked from, and then, you know, complete the road walk. Sometimes there are churches that will let you camp on their premises, and sometimes you'll walk by lodging options like motels, hotels, etc. So there are several options if you're in that situation of a long road walk that you're not going to complete in a day, but it's definitely something that's a good idea to kind of look ahead at a day or two so you can come up with some sort of rough plan. A lot of people have asked, do I think that it's possible to do a thru hike of the Florida Trail with a hammock? And sure, I think that it's possible. I don't know if it would be comfortable in every area, and if you're section hiking, I would certainly say there are some parts that I think would be much better in a tent than a hammock. For example, the levee section right after Big Cypress, it's pretty exposed. There aren't a lot of trees there, so sure, you could do a cowboy camping type setup, or if you had your rain fly / tarp, you know, you could cover yourself if it were to rain. But cowboy camping or open camping like that on the Florida Trail, I feel like would be kind of rough because of all of the bugs. So the mosquitoes, the roaches that we saw on the levees, just in general, there are a lot of bugs. So I would prefer to be enclosed in something that keeps bugs out. But if you were in a pinch for just a few nights and you had to do that, then it could work. Also in the long road walk areas where maybe you could camp at a church, that might be a little iffy, might not be a great setup for hammocking. But again, if you're willing to tough it out those few nights, then I certainly think there are a lot of areas that would be decent for hammocks. But if anybody has thru hiked the entire Florida Trail with a hammock that is watching this, please feel free to weigh in, because obviously I'm a tenter, not a hammocker, so I wasn't thinking about that every night when I set up my tent. Now let's talk about the weather in general. Of course, it's going to vary every year. It depends on when you start. There are a lot of factors that can change it, but from my experience, and starting at the beginning of February 3rd, and ending mid to late May, the lowest the temperatures got were upper 30s. I think the first night on trail was 39, and then it was warmer for a while after that in the 40s at night. Then had another couple of cold snaps back down into the 30s, even up till April. So it's going to fluctuate for sure. We didn't have a lot of rain. The bulk of the rain that we got was in the last couple of weeks of the trail, but it still really wasn't a lot. So of course, if you start sooner than February, you're probably going to deal with mid to lower 30s in temperature. And if you go later than May, then it's certainly going to get warmer at night. Honestly, I thought by May 20th that we would have been just completely roasted in the tent at night. Everybody had me scared to death that we were going to die of heat exhaustion, and it really wasn't bad. I was still comfortable in the tent at night. Of course, I am a cold-natured person, but what I'm saying is it wasn't absolutely miserable that late in the year. We might have been lucky and just gotten a cooler spring than what is normal, but all in all, you know, don't freak out, don't stress too much about when you can start and when you can finish, as long as you're in the winter to early-ish spring months. The warmest temperatures we faced during the day was upper 80s, but most of the time it stayed mid 80s and below. When we first started out, it was like perfect weather for hiking, somewhere in the 40s and 50s at night, and usually no higher than mid 70s during the day. The thing that I love about the Florida Trail is it is a great trail for hiking in the winter without having to freeze your butt off. And it coincides perfectly that the winter months are the lower rain season for them. So if you are in those winter to early spring months, you shouldn't get dumped on too much. But even with that said, I highly recommend having an umbrella for the times that it does rain, but also, again, for the situations where you're exposed and you're getting a lot of sunlight, and that way you can have instant shade. Because the Florida Trail has such a humid climate, you might think that there might be a huge issue with condensation in tents. And don't get me wrong, there's definitely going to be condensation because it is so humid, especially with the single wall tent like the triplex that I used. But it really wasn't much of an issue in comparison to other trails for me. The way the triplex is designed, the water can just run down the wall and through the mesh that's around the bathtub floor. It's really not an issue as long as you're not brushing up against the wall of the tent. But in the warmer climates like the Florida Trail, I don't really stress about it quite as much. Yes, you can get hypothermia even in the summertime, but it's less likely of an issue to worry about than if you're in the middle of wintertime. So even if your sleeping bag does get damp or your clothes do get damp, chances are you're gonna get to dry them out the next day. And if it happens to be raining, you're still not gonna freeze to death, most likely on the Florida Trail. So I just didn't stress about the condensation that much. I always have redundancies in my pack to make sure that something I have is dry. I took a puffy coat on the Florida Trail because we pack our fears and I'm afraid of being cold. So that was safe and dry in my clothes bag. So if my sleeping bag were to have gotten soaked from the condensation in my tent and it rained all the next day, so I didn't get a chance to dry it out, well, the next night, if I had to sleep in my dry sleeping clothes with my puffy coat, I would have been fine. Maybe not as comfortable as I would have been in my sleeping bag, but I would have been fine. Navigation. The Florida Trail is pretty well maintained through most of the areas. There are some that are better maintained than others, but all in all, the blazing is pretty fresh. The area that I would say was trickiest to navigate was Bradwell Bay. I'm sure it's kind of a booger to go through there and to do the trail maintenance and to carry a paint can through there. I mean, just carrying myself through there was tough enough. So I do recommend having the Guthook app just because I like having a GPS app that will work even if I don't have service when my phone is in airplane mode and can specifically tell me, yes, you are on the trail, or no, you're not, you're a little bit off to the east, etc. But I can't think of an area on the Florida Trail where I felt like without that app I would have been 100% lost or I couldn't have figured it out. But sometimes, especially when you're on a long road walk, you can kind of start daydreaming and not paying attention to where the turnoff for the trail is. So having that app too, I don't have to start freaking out, oh my gosh, should I pass it, and then end up backtracking to look for it, you know, all that. You have that information right there in your hands. Also, you've got water source information, campsite information, information about town like restaurants, lodging, etc. But the Guthook app is the only thing that I used for navigation on the Florida Trail, and I 100% recommend that. Now I want to cover resupplies. Along the way, there are plenty of areas to resupply on the Florida Trail. All of them aren't necessarily full of a lot of options, but you come across convenience stores, gas stations, grocery stores, etc. all along the way. And the longest food carry I planned for while on trail was, I believe, maybe 4 days, 4 to 5 days, but I was going a lot slower than probably most people would. So chances are most hikers would have to plan for 3 to 4 days max. But even in those longer stretches where I thought, okay, I got to get all my food for this stretch, I'd end up finding a convenience store or a gas station or something that was maybe a half mile off trail where I could get a few more snacks, because it's always way more exciting to eat what you don't have in your pack than what you do have in your pack. If you're not picky, you're gonna find something to eat, but if you're looking for freeze-dried backpacker meals, they aren't plentiful along the trail. It's just the community surrounding the Florida Trail isn't as vast as, you know, the AT or even the PCT. So some of those hiker staples aren't as available. But as long as you're fine with the pasta sides, rice sides, ramen noodles, etc., you'll find something. But if you want anything a little bit more fancy, like a Mountain House meal, then you might have to do resupply boxes to some of the post offices. The only thing that I had an issue finding on trail was fuel canisters. And that's mainly because I use the BRS stove. It weighs an ounce, which I think is awesome, but it is not compatible with the Coleman fuel canisters. So you can find those at Walmart, but if you use the BRS stove, they just don't screw down and allow fuel to flow through. But I did get a fuel canister from a Trail Angel along the way. I had some mailed to me, and I made a habit of carrying the larger fuel canisters so that they would last me longer. I never ended up completely running out of fuel though and not being able to cook when I wanted to, but that's just something to be mindful of. One of the other big challenges I found on the Florida Trail in comparison to some of the other trails I've hiked is hitchhiking can be a bit tricky. I think that's mainly because a lot of people along the Florida Trail have no idea it exists there, and they're just not aware of the backpacking community in general. So definitely, as you go through the Florida Trail, sprinkle in some awareness. Let as many people as you can know about the Florida Trail, and so hopefully that way they'd be more inclined to help hikers in the future. But anyway, hitchhiking, sometimes we could easily get a hitch. Other times we sat there for an hour plus and never got anybody to even slow down or not like swerve away from us. But in those instances, we were able to find some way to get to town, whether that was with Uber or Lyft or a local taxi cab service, or possibly even a trail angel who's local to the area. So there are ways to get around on the Florida Trail if you need to, but thankfully you don't have to hitchhike for all of your resupply situations, because a lot of them you just walk straight on through. Also, as a side note, if you don't want to deal with having to hitchhike or worrying about how you're going to get around, the Florida Trail is one of the trails that I think you could easily do a leapfrog type situation with 2 vehicles. So you stage 2 of them, drive one up ahead, hike to the one that's south of the second one, and then drive that one above, and just kind of keep doing the same thing. On the Florida Trail, when you're ready for a shower, a 0 day, a chance to do some laundry, there are a lot of lodging options along the way. There are even some like bona fide campgrounds that have shower houses and things like that. Unfortunately, there aren't a ton of hostels like on the Appalachian Trail. In fact, the only real hostel situation, not hostile, but hostel, is Wilton's Hilton once you get up in the Panhandle area. Wilton is an incredible human being, and the Hillcrest Baptist Church there has set up a hiker hostel area so you can do your laundry, shower, stay for a few days, etc. there. But that's the only true hostel setup along the Florida Trail. And there aren't specific regions that I can say, oh my gosh, this area is so much more expensive than this area. Like on the AT, it's known that in the south, lodging seems to be a bit cheaper than when you get up to the northeastern states. So on the Florida Trail, it's just hit or miss. Sometimes you're in areas that are a bit more expensive, like maybe the Orlando area, where when you're more kind of in the middle of nowhere, then the places might not be as expensive. But you can read about that again in the Guthook app, the different lodging options, and you can call ahead and inquire. I have Verizon, and most of the days that I was out there, at least at some point in the day, I was able to get a call or a text out to let somebody know that I was alive. There might literally be a handful of days where I didn't have service at all. But while you may not have full bars to do everything you would normally do on a phone, you should be able to at least communicate. Now, I did carry my InReach Mini anyway. I like knowing that I can hit the SOS button at any given time, because my luck, I'd get bit by a rattlesnake or, break something serious in a situation where I suddenly didn't have cell service, in one of those small time frames. So I still think it's a good idea to have some sort of personal locator beacon, and that might be the better route if you don't have any of that stuff. If you know, hey, I'm gonna have cell service most of the time, so I should be able to check in with that, but I'm gonna take this personal locator beacon in the case of emergency where I really do need help and I don't have cell service, because with the personal locator beacons, you can't communicate back and forth. The Spot device is a little bit more expensive, but you can send pre-programmed messages through that. And then the InReach standard size or mini, like I use, you're able to send messages back and forth and communicate pretty much like normal, except you can't send pictures or videos. But so the InReach Mini was probably a little bit overkill for this trail, but I already had it, so it made sense. If I was gonna go do a thru hike of the Florida Trail and I was a little bit worried about budget, but wanted to have something for emergency situations, I just get a one-time use personal locator beacon. Permits. There are some permits that you need along the way on the Florida Trail, and some of the places you'll pass through, there's even a number to call just to notify whatever place is over that particular piece of land that you're going through, because there might be a hunt going on that they can warn you about, or you may take a reroute because of something that's going on. But the main permit you need to worry about before you leave home is just being a Florida Trail Association member and having that proof with you. Now, there are other sections that require permits like Eglin Air Force Base, but you kind of hear about those as you go along. I'll put a link in the video description of this video that's got all of the areas that you will need a permit. And that information is also in Guthook. You'll see people comment about it like, now's a good time to go ahead and get ready to get a permit for such and such area, because you'll have a better idea when you get closer about what exact dates you'll be through that area. But again, the main thing that you have to make sure of is that you are a Florida Trail Association member. Now, nowhere along the Florida Trail did anyone ever ask me to see my permit, my ID, or proof that I was a thru hiker of the Florida Trail. But I say log on to the Florida Trail Association website, get your membership anyway, because that way you're giving back to the organization and to the resources that make the Florida Trail experience possible for us hikers. So I'm sure some of y'all are wondering, how exactly does one get to the southern terminus or the northern terminus, and to and from really? So the southern terminus, the way that I got there, I drove a rental car from Alabama down to Lantana area in Florida, West Palm Beach area, left the car there at Enterprise, so took a hit with the one-way rental fee. And then a trail angel that I'd heard about from a friend took us from Lantana to the southern terminus of the Florida Trail, which is in Big Cypress Preserve, and it is the Oasis Visitor Center. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. So if you do go from one of the bigger populated cities, chances are you can get an Uber or a Lyft that will pick you up and take you out there. Or you can get on the Florida Trail Facebook group. There's a Florida Trail hikers group, and then there's typically a thru hiker group for whatever current year it is. I can put those links also in the video description of this video, so you can check that out. But there is a pretty great trail angel community around the Florida Trail. Of course, we could always use more, but around the time that people would typically start a thru hike, those trail angels are looking for people who might need help getting to or from the southern or northern terminus. Now, the northern terminus is up there in Fort Pickens in the Panhandle, Pensacola area. So again, a more populated area. I know that Yellow Cab services the trailhead up there. Of course, you could always hitchhike to either of these termini, but I like to have something a bit more planned and scheduled, so I know I actually get there in a reasonable amount of time. When we left Fort Pickens, Yellow Cab was willing to come pick us up there, but we hitched a ride with a park ranger who happened to be leaving the park. But I do know that Yellow Cab will service that area, and I'm sure that potentially other local taxi cab services will also. So I've kind of hit on some of this already, but I'll go ahead and explicitly state it. How long does it take to thru hike the Florida Trail, and when do people typically start? Well, of course it depends, because you can go from the south to the north, so NOBO or northbound, or you can go from the north to the south, so SOBO, which, as Jupiter Hike states in some of his videos, it's like WeBo if you're westbound, and I don't know. Anyway, because of the Panhandle, it gets weird. But if you are going northbound, then fortunately for you, you kind of follow the cold weather as it's disappearing going north. If you're starting southbound, then it might be colder up north when you start, but you're kind of racing the heat because it's going to start warming up down south pretty quickly. So it seems that southbound hikers would typically want to start sooner than northbound hikers. But technically, you could hike the Florida Trail anytime you wanted to, because it's safe to do so and recommended to do so in the winter months. Whereas in the summer months, it could be a bit more dangerous with water sources drying up and also getting overheated. So the typical time that people seem to start is anywhere from early December up to mid-January at the latest. Again, we started going northbound in February. It's February 3rd. Started late because we were on the Pinhoti Trail, then got COVID, had to quarantine, and then finally got to start the Florida Trail at the beginning of February. Typically, it takes hikers 60 to 90 days to do the Florida Trail. We ended up landing at the northern terminus at over just a little bit 100 days, so definitely took longer than most people, but we had an injury or two along the way. Also had to get off trail because my sister graduated college, and Marty had to record a single, so had a couple of things going on. And honestly, I just enjoyed taking my sweet time on the Florida Trail because I wasn't racing winter, racing the snow at the end. And also, I think that I still had some residual effects of COVID going on, so I never quite got up to the typical stride that I would on a thru hike, especially considering how flat it was. One of the things that I was a bit confused about before I started the Florida Trail was the alternate routes. There are two areas where you can kind of split off and go either east or west. And the first one that you encounter is around Lake Okeechobee. I chose to go west around Lake Okeechobee mainly because that's what everybody does. I know some people have taken the east route. There are some people who have done the whole Okeechobee loop. Either side, I think, has a good bit of construction going on right now with them working on the dam for Lake Okeechobee. So at this point, I don't know that one is necessarily better than the other. Either way you go, I think you're going to run into civilization and resupplies, etc. But I just heard for the most part that west is best around Lake Okeechobee, so I didn't argue it and just went with the flow. And then around the Orlando area, if you go east, you get a bit more of the Ocala National Forest and the springs. If you go west, then you end up getting to Trumps through the Green Swamp, which I actually thought sounded really cool, but I wanted to check out the springs in Ocala National Forest. Unfortunately, when we got to Juniper and Alexander Springs, it was kind of a cloudy, cold day, so we couldn't really enjoy cooling off and soaking in the springs. But Ocala was nice. If I had to do it again, I would probably go west just so I could check out the Green Swamp. But the biggest negative aspect about going west if you're a northbound hiker is that there's like a 60-mile road walk right out of the gate. And I think either east or west around Orlando, you have the same, pretty close to the same amount of miles of road walking, but it's kind of all condensed in one and right out of the gate if you go west around Orlando, where east it's a bit more broken up. So either way, east or west on either of those areas that the trail splits off, it's fine. There are resupply options and the Florida Trail does exist. So if you're not quite ready to dive on in and commit to a full thru hike of the Florida Trail, there are some sections that I thought were pretty awesome that would make great section hikes or even day hikes, because you could park on either end, hike in for part of the day and come back out the same day. To start that list, definitely Big Cypress. It is just prehistoric. It is Jurassic Park in Florida. Whether you have a high water year and you're going through the water or you're going through the mud, it's definitely going to be a challenge. But the beauty of it and just the unique ecosystem around me, I was enthralled with and didn't even care that I was having to tromps through the swamp. I highly recommend the Big Cypress section. That might be my favorite stretch of trail ever. Next, Eglin Air Force Base. This is by far, to me, the most beautifully maintained section of trail. Also, it has amazing water sources that are clear. They don't smell like sulfur. You can get in them and hang out, cool off. And I just like that the trail is so wide. It's not super brushy, so you're not having to fight ticks the whole time you're walking. It's definitely a section that I would go back and visit again. The people there take pride in it and work hard on it. The Swanee River section is one that I would definitely like to revisit, maybe even by kayak this time. So you do see people out there kayaking the river, you get views of the river, but there are also rolling hills, which isn't super common on the flat Florida Trail. It's where the river has flooded and ebbed and flowed, and so it's just this nice rolling hill terrain, and I love it. It's a beautiful section. There are also these nice shelters that they've got set up for people who are on the river, but it's a nice crossover with hiking because hikers get to use them too. There's also a stretch of trail that I think is possibly one of the most beautiful parts of the trail, and it's a very marshy area right before you get to St. Mark's. Now, the area that's immediately before the St. Mark's River and the town of St. Mark's is not well maintained and there was a lot of bushwhacking through there, but the very open and exposed area before that, where you're in the Big Bend section, where you can see a long stretch of the peninsula part of the state, but you're standing in the Panhandle state, that area was absolutely gorgeous. And that's where I first realized, like, oh my gosh, we're right here at the Gulf. So I would definitely love to go back and do a day hike of that area again. I want to give an honorable mention to Ocala National Forest. I know that is a favorite section of trail for a lot of Florida Trail enthusiasts. For me, it looked like typical woodsy Florida, palm trees. That's also the birthplace of the Florida Trail. But I think one of the biggest draws about Ocala National Forest is the springs, Juniper Springs and Alexander Springs. And while those would be probably incredible if you hit them on a hot day, when I went through, it was overcast and kind of cold. So I wasn't really chomping at the bit to hop in the freezing cold water and soak. So maybe if it had been a warmer day, I would just really love Ocala National Forest even more, but it is a nice section of trail and one that I think would be enjoyable to do section hikes or day hikes of. And finally, I want to throw this in there for those of you who just like to torture yourselves. If you're up for a really big challenge and you just like to beat the crap out of yourself, then might I recommend the Bradwell Bay section. That was by far, in my opinion, the most difficult part of the trail, going through the swamps. I hear that some parts of the year it can be dry, or in particular years, but for me the water was pretty deep in some areas. I enjoyed it, but I doubt that I would ever go back to enjoy it again. But again, if you like the challenge, you like seeing snakes and other wildlife, then you might enjoy the Bradwell Bay section of trail. If you have no interest in hiking the Florida Trail, or maybe even if you just want to do some day hikes, section hikes, or heck, even if you're a thru hiker, if you live in the state of Florida or you plan on visiting at any point and you want to do some sort of trail angeling or trail magic experience, there are groups, as I've already mentioned in this video, on Facebook that you can get more information about how to do that. There is a solid trail angeling group around the Florida Trail, but it always helps to have more, so that's something to also keep in mind. And I'm sure the Florida Trail Association is always looking for new members to help with trail maintenance, so that's also something. Or if you just want to support the cause in general, then you can always send a donation to the Florida Trail Association, who will put that to good use on the trail. If you want to know more about the gear I took with me on the Florida Trail and how it performed, I'll put the link to a video where I go into a lot of detail about that in the video description of this video. All right, y'all, well, that is all I have for you today. Hopefully this information is helpful to any of y'all who are thinking about getting out and trekking on the Florida Trail. If you have any questions that were not answered in this video, please feel free to leave those in the comments below, and I will do my best to get to those, or somebody else in the community can hopefully answer those questions also. Thank y'all so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe before you go, and we will see y'all next time.